Hi, everyone. Going to look at the history of modern sake in this lecture from the late 19th century to actually the 21st century, asking how sake changes as a beverage during this time. Let me adjust my camera right here. There we go. And we'll get started. First of all, the question is, how did sake change in the modern period? And we're going to begin our discussion of the modern period with the Meiji period from 1868 to 1912. Meiji, of course, is a foundational period in Japanese history. With the rise of modern Japan, Japan changed so much in the Meiji period. There would be a lot to talk about if we wanted to talk about the Meiji period in general, but I'm going to focus on sake brewing. I mentioned also the end of home brewing because home brewing, making sake at home, had been part of Japanese history since before history, and that becomes illegal in the middle of the Meiji period. And we'll ask why did that happen and what the implications are of that. Then we're going to fast forward to the Second World War and look at what's called to be sake's greatest sin, this beverage called sanbai joshu or sanzoshu. Literally, it means 3 times more sake. We'll find out what that is and why it's a sin. Third, we're going to look at the rise of second-class sake in the 1970s and 1980s. And to do that, we'll understand the old ranking system for sake, which ranked sake as special, first, and second class. And then why is it that that second-class sake became so prominent in the 1970s and 80s, when, after all, you have special and first class? Why did people say the second-class sake was so good? And then finally, we're going to reflect on the fact that the best sake ever in Japanese history could be said is being made in Japan today, but why isn't anybody drinking it? Why is sake as a beverage only 6% of Japan's alcohol market? Well, we're going to answer that question, or try to, looking at some long-term trends. So let's get started. Moving on to the Meiji period, really the beginning of modern Japan. Lots of things are happening as the government, we have a national government that's modernizing. We have a modern banking system, modern military, modern political system. All sorts of things are happening during the Meiji period. And you could spend lecture after lecture talking just about all those developments. But let's focus in on brewing. And it's interesting to note that the government is taking a role in the development of sake. And what happens specifically is the Ministry of Finance establishes the National Research Institute of Brewing in 1904, the NRIB. And what this is a organization meant to improve sake. The NRIB is involved in the isolation of yeast, so the development of commercial yeast, whereas in the past, if you go back to the early modern period, people didn't even know what yeast was. Then it gets identified in the late 19th century, and it's not soon after that, or not long after that, rather, that yeast is isolated and sold commercially. And a number of these commercial yeasts are made available by the NRIB. The NRIB is also crucial in the development of Yamahai sake, and Yamahai, I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but it's a technique that evolved from the old Kimoto style of brewing sake, which was something that developed in the early modern period. And basically with Kimoto, you have the brewers mashing the ferment initially. They have these long oars and they grind at the rice in shallow tubs. And they have to do this for a period of time, and it's very labor intensive. Well, someone figured out that you could bypass that. You could do what's called the Yamahai method simply by warming things up a little bit, warming the ferment up a little bit, and you didn't have to go through this laborious process of churning the mash with oars or like pestles. Oh yeah. Well, One of the reasons this was possible is because the rice is more finely milled. You didn't have to have roughly milled rice like they did in the early modern period. In other words, rice that wasn't milled very much, you'd have to really work it. And that was one of the reasons for the Kimoto method. Um, with better polished rice, Yamahai method becomes possible just by heating the mix. And then the whole purpose of this Kimoto or Yamahai is to build up the lactic acid that was necessary for brewing. Lactic acid provides a nice atmosphere for the yeast to develop in. It gets rid of other microbes and things that might get no yeast's way. And so once lactic acid, its role was figured out, someone just said, hey, rather than go through this whole process, let's just add a little dose of lactic acid. And that became the dominant method for brewing that the NRIB developed in 1912, and it spread to almost all breweries, and most breweries do this that way today. So bear in mind the fact that it's the Taxation Bureau, the Bureau of Finance, that's behind the NRIB. And that helps us to understand why homebrewing was made illegal. Now, homebrewing had been part of Japanese history since before history. People had always been brewing at home and making very simple sake recipes. As for doburoku, doburoku might just be one batch of ingredients that aren't even filtered. And doburoku was the working man's sake of the early modern period. If you went to an izakaya, your chances are you're going to order an inexpensive doburoku that you drank rather fresh. Maybe it's kind of watered down. It's like a power drink or energy drink of the early modern period. It's really almost like a foodstuff. So why did the government ban it in 1899 along with home brewing? Well, initially, they tried to license these things. They would have people buy licenses to home brew. And that project was very successful. In 1895, roughly 14% of households nationally had licenses for home brewing. And with areas up in the northern parts of Japan and Kyushu having the highest numbers of these. And what's remarkable is that people who are making doburoku are often making it as much doburoku as they are sake in some places of Japan. And in other places, they're making even more doburoku than sake. So there's a heck of a lot of home brewing going on. And this is all that's just was reported. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are doing more when it's just not telling people about it, not buying licenses and not paying taxes on it. Well, all well and good if you are a consumer and you like brewing your own. But from the government's perspective, this is a problem. Why? Because people who are home brewing are not buying professionally made sake. They're not buying from sake breweries. And by the end of the 19th century, the government is looking at this practice and they're saying, hey, a lot of breweries are struggling right now, and it must be because of home brewing. Never mind the fact that there are substantial government taxes on breweries. Never mind the fact that there are real economic problems in the 1880s in Japan. No, it was home brewing that was viewed to be the problem for sake. So in 1899, sake could no longer be brewed at home, and people could not make doburoku. In fact, you couldn't make any kind of cloudy sake at all. Did that mean that doburoku disappeared? No, it did not. It went underground, and you have references to doburoku in the 1960s being called a national pastime. And there were certain activists in the 1980s who tried to revive doburoku and touted it as a better form of sake. Ultimately, this led to a court case in 1989 that said that people could not brew at home. And the reason that the Supreme Court judge in Japan gave this decision was because of taxes. It cut into government tax revenues. So the right to brew was trumped by the government's need for taxes. So this is really the reason why a government cracked down on home brewing. Sake, revenue from sake, the taxes levied on sake brewers were a substantial part of government revenue in the Meiji period. In 1894, 16% of the government's total tax revenues came from the sake industry. And that went up to 35% in 1900. So when we think about Japan in the Meiji period, how it's changing, how it's modernizing, what paid for that? Well, certainly taxes on ordinary people paid for it, but also taxes on breweries. And if it wasn't for those taxes on breweries, then Japan wouldn't have been able to expand its military from 200,000 troops in 1894 to 600,000 troops in 1900. At least that's the perspective of sake scholars. They really can see the taxes on breweries as contributing to Japan's militarization. So the upshot of it is home brewing is still illegal, and taxes are the reason. Government still derives a lot of tax revenues from breweries. Not as much as in the Meiji period, but it's still substantial. Let's fast forward again to the wartime period and think about the situation in the 1930s. Japan is at war on the continents, and it's mobilizing for a greater war. In fact, in 1938, there's a national general mobilization law that's issued. And what that does is it places limitations on polishing rice and puts price controls on rice. Now, if you're a sake brewer, that's a real problem if the government's saying you can't buy polished rice anymore. So that's an issue. In 1939, also government is setting prices for goods. So in 1939, they set prices for consumer goods like miso, soy sauce, salt, fresh fish, even matches to light cooking fires. So all these prices are being set, and those prices are being set also on sake. And if you're a sake brewer and the government is telling you how much you can sell your sake for, that puts you in a hard position. So what a lot of brewers are doing at this time is they're watering down the sake. After all, they can't make the profit that they feel that they want or they need, and so they are watering the sake, and many consumers are complaining about goldfish sake that is so low in alcohol that a goldfish could live in it. You can also see in 1939 that department stores are ordered to substitute barley for rice, and you no longer could have displays of food outside restaurants. And this is where we have the rise of food models that you see outside restaurants in Japan today. This dates back to 1939. 1940, we can see there's more price controls on other foodstuffs. And in 1943, the government basically takes over alcohol production. And in that year, the Ministry of Finance orders that half of Japan's breweries close and half of the brewery labor force be transferred to industries that support the war. So to give you an example, in Fushimi, before this time, there were 70 sake breweries. And after this 1943 order, that 70 sake breweries became 34 sake breweries. And the sake brewers who remained reduced their volume of production by 46.2%. So the government's really tamping down on sake. But interestingly enough, it's not doing the same for beer. Why is that? Well, the ingredients for beer, barley and wheat, were not viewed as important as staples as rice. The way sake relies, of course, on rice. And with rice being viewed as a staple, the government is trying to control the amount of rice that goes into sake. And indeed, we see that early on when the government is restricting the purchase of polishing rice. You had to eat brown rice through these wartime mobilization laws. But beer is something that the government is backing, and they see it as important to the war effort. So up until the end of World War II, frontline troops are getting beer. But sake production, as we saw, is greatly curtailed. And I think that contributed to the rise of beer consumption after the war and the tapering off of sake consumption after the war. So around 1959, beer becomes the number one alcoholic beverage, replacing sake. And maybe government policies during the wartime had something to do with that. Well, this brings us to one of sake's sins, and that refers to this concoction called sanbai joshu or sanzoshu, which literally means 3 times more sake. So given that sake brewers could not have access to as much rice as they needed, they began to experiment with substitutes for sake rice. And this happened in Manchuria. And initially, there were breweries in Manchuria that were Japanese sake breweries. They couldn't get rice locally. They couldn't get it from Korea. They tried to experiment with rice grown outside of paddies, so-called upland rice, but that didn't work very well. So they began tinkering with a sake recipe. And they thought, well, what is sake? Sake is composed of rice, water, and koji. Maybe we'll just add a little more water. No, that dilutes the sake. How about we add some alcohol? We can make more sake that way. So that's something that people tinkered around with. But just adding alcohol to existing sake doesn't really produce a very good sake. So over time, and this experiments began in 1941, brewers in Manchuria and then in mainland Japan discovered that if they added water, added more alcohol, brewer's alcohol made from sugar or wherever, brewer's alcohol, if they added lactic acid, if they added amino acids like monosodium glutamate, then they could approximate something that tasted like sake. And they hit upon this in 1941. The NIRB allowed breweries in Japan to try this, and effectively they're able to triple sake production. So if you are making just sake and you start with 10 koku of rice, that'll produce 15 koku of sake. And koku, of course, is a traditional measurement. If you don't know what a koku is, don't worry about it right now. We're kind of getting a frame of reference here. So 10 koku of rice produces 15 koku of sake, and that when you sell it, you could water it down to 17 koku. Got that? Well, if you start adding sugars and brewer's alcohol and amino acids and MSG and things like that, you can take that same 10 koku of rice and not make 17 koku of sake from it, but actually 42 koku of sake, or even 52 if you water it down even more. So in other words, you can make 3 times more sake. And that's what this term sanbai joshu, or another word for it is sanzoshu, developed. You could just tinker with a sake recipe and add these ingredients, and you have 3 times more sake. It's understandable that brewers would need to do this during World War II when resources are in low supply, when the government is saying you can't use polished rice, you have to use brown rice. It made sense. But the problem with this, and what makes this a sin for sake, is that production of sanzoshu or sanbai joshu, this 3 times more sake, continues after the war. It goes on into the 1950s. It goes on to the 1970s. It doesn't really fully taper off until 2006. So a lot of the sake that's produced is, you could even say it's not even sake. It's this sanbai joshu. It's this. It starts off as sake, but then 2/3 of the ingredients are something else, are artificial. I'm going to get back to that point in just a moment, but let me talk about one more thing that was added to sake, something that was added from 1903 to 1969, and that was salicylic acid. And what that is a preservative. It was something that was suggested by a Western specialist who was working in Japan that Japanese didn't have to pasteurize their sake. They could add salicylic acid, and that would preserve sake. Now, salicylic acid is something that's used today to treat things like dandruff and warts and acne, so it's safe topically, but you're not supposed to eat it. If you eat salicylic acid, you're going to get headaches, you'll get indigestion, seizures, you might even have a heart attack from eating this stuff. The Japanese government knew quickly that this is not something you're supposed to add to food, so very soon after it debuted in the 19th century, it was prohibited to add to food. However, sake brewers could continue to use it until 1969. And they used it along with pasteurization. So this is kind of a scary chemical that was in sake meant as a preservative. And I think if we're thinking about the reasons why sake declined in popularity in the post-war period, well, it was salicylic acid is part of the story. One more important thing about that happened in the Second World War is the development of a ranking system. And this ranking system was in effect from 1943 to 1989. And it comes out of the fact that sake is a very important revenue source for the government. Even though it's cutting down on sake brewing, even though it's restricting the number of breweries and how much sake they can make, even if it's restricting the number of ingredients or the amount of ingredients that can go into sake, specifically rice, still sake is a really key revenue for the government. And this ranking system recognized that. And as a matter of fact, it was a revenue driver for the government. This system was not based on quality. It was based upon how much revenue the government could obtain from sake brewers. So the system had lots of different permutations, but basically there were three categories. There was special class at the top, and then there was first class, second rank, and then there was so-called second rank sake. Technically, there were differences between these, but if you were a brewer, you could work the testing in your favor and basically have any sake that you produced ranked as any class. But the trick here was the cost. So if you're a brewer and you wanted to have your sake called second class or first class or special class, you had to pay more money. Basically, a first class sake rating was 2.5 times more than a second class sake rating, and a special class sake rating was 5 times more expensive than a second class rating. So what this means is sake breweries, large ones, could pay more money and then have their sake called special or first class. And did this have anything to do with the quality of the sake, the taste of the sake? No, not at all. So brewers simply paid, and if they paid enough money, they could have their sake called special or first class. Now think about this from the standpoint of consumers. You might think you're going to be getting a nice sake, you're going to have a special sake, a first class sake, yet that sake may not be very good at all. And a lot of that sake that's produced has added alcohol. In fact, 99% of the sake in this period is got added alcohol. The term junmaishu is something people would not know. This all rice sake, junmaishu. Even sake brewers may not recognize that term. What didn't really become part of sake discourse until the 1980s. So the amount of junmaishu that's being produced is insignificant, maybe 1%. And that's kind of ironic because junmaishu is one of the legal categories for sake today. But we're looking again at this old system, we can see it's just a matter of how much brewers are willing to pay to have their sake ranked special or first class. And who's doing this? Well, it's the major breweries who can afford to do these sort of things. The brewers of Nada, the 15 major breweries in Japan who make half of all the sake. They're the ones who can have their sake listed as special or first class. They're the ones who advertise on television in the post-war period. They're the ones who are the big brand names that we recognize today. And here's the irony of this, because these breweries are selling first or special class sake, but oftentimes that sake is not their own. It's sake that they purchase from other breweries. So there's this practice called barrel buying. And what that means is a large brewery will buy barrels of sake from a smaller brewery and then take it back to their main brewery and then reblend it and package it as their own sake. So for example, you might have a large brewery that sells special or first class sake, and they buy second class sake from a local brewery, and then they blend it and resell it as special or first class sake under their own label. And that's very frustrating for consumers too when they find out about it, because supposedly they're getting a product from a specific maker, but in fact that maker is buying sake from all over Japan, and they're buying that second class sake. Now, second class sake, as we'll see in a moment, doesn't necessarily mean it's bad sake, but still, it's not necessarily the sake that's on the label. So a lot of the major breweries are doing this, and the brewers of Nada, and Nada we saw was an important location for breweries between Kobe and Osaka, where 1/3 of the sake is made. Still to this day, Nada became prominent in the sake industry in the early 19th century. It's still prominent today. So this practice of barrel buying allows large companies to sell more sake. For small brewers, it's not so bad, because if they sell their sake to a large producer, if they sell their barrels, then they can sell those barrels without paying taxes on them to the federal government. So that worked to their advantage. But still, from the side of consumers, it's problematic because you don't know where your sake is really made. And if we're thinking about why sake is in decline right now, this past practice is perhaps one of those reasons. Moving on to the 1970s, there's a growing recognition that so-called second-class sake is not bad sake. People, beginning with journalists, start publicizing the fact that, wait a second, this ranking system that developed in 1943, it's not based on quality. And hey, if you start looking around in different areas of Japan, there's actually this second-class sake that's really good. And the term that's given for this is local sake, or jizake. Previously, jizake was sort of a derogatory term, but in the 1970s, it becomes something that's sought after. There's a growing recognition of the importance of local rural culture and local rural foods in the 1970s and 80s, and so this local sake movement is part of that. And it really begins in 1968 when a sake journalist tries and publicizes their experience drinking Koshi no Kanbai, a sake from Niigata. And they said, wait a second, this is supposedly a second-class sake, but if I were to compare it to anything, I would say it's like a Johnny Walker, fine scotch. It's really good stuff. And other brands were highlighted throughout Japan as being, of exceptional quality, but nonetheless second class according to the ranking system, because these small breweries just didn't want to have to pay what the major players are paying to have their sake ranked higher. Or maybe they just didn't see the validity of that ranking system. They just went on, they made their own quality sake locally. So from the 1970s, 1980s, there's a boom of interest in this local sake. People are getting away from the major brands, exploring these local types of sake. And eventually that ranking system that debuted in 1943 is phased out, and a new ranking system that we know today, which does place emphasis on terms like all rice sake, junmaishu, and premium sake, ginjo and daiginjo, that takes over. And I think that's part of that recognition that you really have to, if you're going to give ranks to sake, you have to say something about quality. That's not to say that what's called a premium sake today, a ginjo or a daiginjo, is necessarily better than futsushu, an ordinary sake, a table sake. But there's certain expectations of a ginjo or a daiginjo that you can have, whereas before this, if you were buying a special or first class sake, you didn't know what you're getting. You didn't know if it was good or not. So the fact that this new ranking system, at least on the surface, takes into account quality is a major step forward. So we have greater interest in not just local sake in the 1970s, but also in sake that's just made with rice without added alcohol. That term debuts in 1968, but like I said before, it's really, not part of sake discourse since the 1980s. A lot of people, 1970s, wouldn't know what the term junmaishu means today. Around this time, preservatives, that salicylic acid, is banned from sake. And besides the local sake movement, we have the premium sake movement that takes off in the 1980s. And that too also helps influence the fact that the sake ranking system changes. So really, some of the best sake, whether it's all rice or just having sake with a little bit of alcohol added, is being produced today. So the question is, why is nobody drinking this great stuff? Why is sake's market share among alcoholic beverages just about 6%? Well, yeah, that's a real story. We can look in this in terms of sake production and how sake production peaked around 1974 and has been falling steadily since then. Also, a number of breweries are almost half of what they were in 1974. So there's lots of downward trends in sake making and production. And, why is this? Well, why if sake is so good today, gone are the problems with salicylic acid, gone are the sanbai joshu, why is nobody drinking it? Lots of reasons here. Even though this 3 times more sake, sanbai joshu, is no longer around, still I think it contributed to sake's bad PR, as did the practices of barrel buying, which aren't prevalent today, but they contributed to sake's bad PR. Beer, certainly the rise of beer consumption didn't help sake, and beer becomes the #1 alcoholic beverage from 1959 and kind of moves on from there. And recall that the wartime government supported beer production, but really cut sake production. Beer, contrast to sake, was seen as something as modern, something that women could drink. It was cool and crisp and fashionable. And sake kind of has this reputation sometimes of being an old man's drink. Even today, even as the brewers are trying to change that perception, it's something that persists. Other reasons for the decline in sake production or consumption are changing demographics. People are not drinking as much alcohol in general in Japan. And people's taste preferences have changed. If we think about Japan in the 1980s, the economy's booming. People are switching to European wines. There's a wine boom in the 1980s in Japan. People are drinking more red wine. Today, it's Japanese whiskey that's all the rage. So there's other choices that consumers can make. They can drink beer, wine, whiskey. They can drink prepackaged cocktail drinks, things like that. There's many more options available for people who are interested in alcohol, and people are not as drinking as much in Japan as they once did. And maybe they're preferring quality and variety instead of quantity, the way previous generations had. So there's lots of reasons that sake's consumption has fallen and fallen to about 6%. I mean, maybe some good news is that with growing interest overseas, more and more brewers are shipping to the United States, to Europe, to Asia, and those markets are growing. They're growing rather small. They're still very small markets, but still there's hope that maybe the overseas market will help save the sake industry. And maybe people in Japan will see folks outside of Japan turn to sake and say how cool sake is, and then that'll cause folks in Japan to reevaluate this traditional alcoholic beverage. We can really hope so, because it would be a shame to see, sake disappear. I don't think it's going to happen, but we'd like to see a vibrant sake industry, not one where it's declining almost annually. So that concludes the talk. I covered a lot of ground here. Sake in the modern period, the Meiji period, World War II, post-war period, and local sake, and some reasons for sake's decline. This information comes from my forthcoming History of Sake, Kanpai, and that'll be out in October in 2025. So I appreciate your attention and hope that you learned something. And if you have questions, please feel free to contact me. Until next time, take care.